about 10 years later, and we get Dodd-Frank from that. Things that happen in the world reflect. We see what's happening in 2020, and we're getting legislation, but more so, we're seeing private ordering by shareholders saying what they want from companies. And we spend a fair amount of time talking about what boards do. Oh, I meant to hit that slide on ESG that talks about what was going on in 2020, and now that we're in 2021, and how we think about what the corporation is, and that laws and markets change over time. Sometimes they change slow, like an oil tanker. Other times it's like a speedboat, but they do affect what we do. So that is what we did. And by the way, this is our opportunity to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions or comments, and then I can also look at the chat screen and see if there are any questions, because we wanted to be interactive. We do have time at the end to sort of generally, are there any questions, but it's best if we sort of, because we are a familia, to sort of get it out now, as we are all going to be great students, which is we won't be random. We'll talk about what's happening at the moment. So let's pause here.
So there's a question on the chat box, but I want to hold it because we're going to talk about it when we get to the compensation committee discussion.
Gotcha.
The question was, with more and more human capital management entering into board discussions, do we believe more CHROs are going to be serving on boards in the future? The short answer is yes, but the longer answer is let's hold that thought for now.
Absolutely. And if we, without addressing that specifically, let me go back to something which we may have talked about before. And if not, we are going to talk about it in sort of a later session then, is what really makes a great board member. And if we look at board evaluations, and I've done many of them, and we look at the number one issue of how boards, so board members, rate other board members in a board evaluation, probably the number one issue is not the quantity, but the quality of questions that the board member asks. The quality of question, the quality, not the quantity, the quality of questions that you ask. And that's really what other board members really respect from their colleagues. And part of that, and I think we actually will have a session later in this series talking about boardroom diplomacy. How do you ask that question? The process, I think I call them the 4 R's. It's asking the right questions at the right time to the right people about the right things, right? Sounds easier than it is, but that's really the job of board members around these issues that you see here on the screen. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we start going through the committees, and particularly that question about CHROs in the comp committee. But moving forward, I will pass the mic back to you, Susan. To start.
Thank you, and please advance one more slide.
Gotcha.
Thanks. Okay, so this is going to be, sort of really very nuts and bolts how the sausage gets made. You saw the earlier chart of some of the work that the board does. This gets into it in a little bit or a lot more detail. Things like risk philosophy, enterprise risk management, cyber issues, data governance, reputation, disclosure, capital allocation, and on and on and on. The board is responsible for all of those things. And if anything goes wrong in any of those issues, the question is always going to be, well, what was the board doing? Why weren't they providing oversight? So what you have to understand is when people say the board, there's the full board, and there's, sort of a series of meetings every year, usually a strategic offsite, but a lot of the work, the actual work, gets done in the committee level. Those of you who either present to your own company's board or have been on boards yourself have seen how that works, where it's really the very high level strategic issues that happen in the boardroom, but then there may be things that you have to take a deeper dive on. There are some areas, technology being very much one of them, where you may not want to spend an entire board meeting talking about, how are we going to shift to digital? What's our cybersecurity strategy? But board members need to really bring their focused expertise to them. And so those might happen at the committee level. And just from a logistics standpoint, the way it would work would be there will be a committee of board members supported by members of management who report in to that committee. And then the work of the committee is reported out to the full board so that if there are any big strategic decisions to be made based on that work, the board is fully informed. So on the next slide.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll chime in on the next slide. No, the next slide, please go.
Okay. So this is what it looks like for public company boards and for a lot of private company boards as well. Basically, so you've got your board chair somewhere. There's probably a laser, but I'm not even going to try it. You've got your board chair, you've got the 3 committees that are required under the SEC of any public company. Thank you. The audit committee, the nominating and governance committee, and the compensation committee. And each of those will have a chair as well. And then you've got, those are the required committees. Then you've got this other mass of potential committees. And whether you need to have one or decide you want to have one is going to depend on the company. And we'll go through that on the next slide. But just be aware, there is only one other committee that is mandated, and that's for financial services companies. They must have a risk committee. And that comes as after Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank and all of the issues where they want to make sure that there is a deep look at risk and compliance in a committee level. Stephen, did you want to add something?
Sure, and I want to chime in on 2 things. One, to be a little geeky from a legal side of what you just said, which is each of these committees will have charters, which will clearly define what they're supposed to do and what they can't do. So it also explains the authority that they have. And so when Susan says the committees really do the work with the board, and for the most part, it's doing the grunt work for the board until they get to the full board meeting and they report out. And then the board, if there's a vote needs to be made, the full board votes. Many times things are delegated to committees for them to drill down on, do the deep dive, but they can't take action. The action has to be taken at the full board. And so if I can give you an example, which comes up in the last 12 months, we'll always ask about other committees, particularly around the ESG. Boards will say, hey, should we have an ESG committee? I will save that discussion, the substantive discussion, to later if it comes up. But I want to make this point. I'm using ESG as a point here. Many boards will say, we want the full board to cover ESG. So the full board's going to do it. And my response to that, which is, by the way, it's okay, because the real response is it depends. And we can talk about that later about why you would want to have a separate committee or why you want to put things into an existing committee. But one of the things that when people say, well, I want the full board to do it, I have another set of questions to drill down, whether that's a throwaway answer, meaning I don't really care about it, we're going to say the full board does it, or it's sort of a lazy answer, or if they really mean business. And what I mean by that is that the committees do the work. So if you give a subject like ESG and say the full board's going to do it, my next question is, when does the full board meet as a committee of the whole to discuss ESG? Because it's not being done at the full board meeting. Because at the full board meeting, they have 18 different things that they have to do, including hearing from audit committee, compensation committee, nom/gov committee, then hearing other things. So they don't have that 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever the other committees, the time they spend to do at the full board meeting, but they can have the full board, technically we call it as a committee of a whole, to tackle an issue. So if someone tells me they're taking an issue like ESG and they want the full board to have responsibility, I look at the agenda. And when I don't see it on the agenda, I know you've even been lazy or it's a throwaway answer and it's not real. But I'm using that example to explain how the board gets work done, and it's really through the committees. And you're relying on your committees to do the work and then report out, because you, as a board member with a full board, will have to vote on those issues. But you are relying on the committees to do that work. Susan?
Thank you. So this is the work of the committees. Now, Stephen mentioned a charter. There are, for public companies, so companies can be listed on the New York Stock Exchange, they can be listed on NASDAQ, you could be listed other places for over-the-counter trading, but for our purposes, it's really the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ that we're concerned about. Each one of those, and since Stephen opened the geeky door, we'll go there. Each one of those has something called listing standards. And in those listing standards, there are very specific rules about things including composition of board committees and what the minimum requirements of what those committees handle might be. These first three, audit, compensation, and nominating governance, and again, these are the three required committees, come primarily from the New York Stock Exchange listing standards. NASDAQ is very similar. It's a little bit looser in some cases because often you've got companies that are at smaller, earlier stages when they go public, but it's not too different. And let me back up for a minute too, which is when you think about all of these committees, so it's useful to know about them, but it's also useful to think, okay, what are my skills? And when I go to a board interview, how am I going to position myself? Because they're not only thinking about, is this a good board member that someone's going to add value to my board, but they're also thinking about where am I going to put that person in the committee structure. So think about this in both of those contexts. So the audit committee, a pure play audit committee, very, very formulaic. You go meet with the external auditor. You meet with the head of internal audit. You have presentations on internal controls over financial reporting, or ICOFR. You have presentations on the whistleblower line. And that piece of it is actually really interesting and important because the audit committee gets to determine what they want to hear about. If there's a complaint that has to do with financial reporting that comes through that concern line, it must be reported to the audit committee. The audit committee can also say, I want to see other things. It would be very, very common for an audit committee to say, if there's any complaint made about a senior executive of the company, I want to see that. And, I, as an audit committee member, may say, you know what, I don't think management should be investigating that. We want to bring in our own outside counsel to investigate it. And the audit committee has an absolute right to do that. So really understanding from an audit committee perspective what the complaints are. One of the things that was a big issue when the Me Too issues were very much in the news was that a lot of companies, the way their concern line complaints come in, there's what's considered the real stuff, which may be 3 complaints a year at most. And then there's this mass of everything else called HR. Well, what they found out as the Me Too issues started coming out was that the massive stuff called HR were women that were complaining about sexual harassment, men complaining about sexual harassment, people complaining that they were retaliated against because they helped someone make a complaint, and on and on and on. And all that stuff got sort of jumbled together into it, let HR handle it. So from an audit committee perspective, to really drill down and say, as Stephen said, board's responsible for compliance. The audit committee has responsibility under SEC rules for that process of that whistleblower line. So knowing how the process works, how employees feel comfortable that it's confidential, and that there is a good process to investigate fairly and take action is absolutely critical. Then financials disclosures, of course. Prior to any earnings call, so every quarter, typically it's a phone call, although maybe it's more of a Zoom call these days, but frequently not an in-person because it's not in conjunction with the board meeting itself. The audit committee will get together with the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, the controller, the head of investor relations, and maybe 1 or 2 other key people. And they'll go through, this is what the quarter looked like, this is how we're going to be reporting it, and these are some of the judgments and estimates that we made. These are some of the critical matters. And that's very much an audit committee conversation. Question was, what is the frequency of these audits? So there's 2 types of audits. There's the external audit, and then there's the internal audit. So the external audit is, the KPMG, the other firms will come in. The actual formal audit comes out once a year. But they are auditing all year round in the sense that they're meeting, for example, when I was in-house on the corporate secretary side, every quarter before the earnings release came out, we would have a meeting with the external auditor who would want to know, has anything come up during the quarter? They meet with, kind of critical, whether it's sales, marketing, operations, but critical business leaders. And so those audits are going on all of the time, but in terms of the written audit, kind of wrapping it up, it's done once a year. The same is true for internal audit. So internal audit, the head of internal audit is the only person in the entire company, other than the CEO, him or herself, who does not report up to the CEO eventually, because by law, the head of internal audit reports to the head of the audit committee. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not beholden to the CFO. They absolutely are, because the CFO works with them every day and the head of an audit doesn't. But it is incumbent on the audit committee to work with the head of internal audit and say, okay, let's talk about what your strategic audit plan is for the year and where are you going to be focusing your resources. And that whole internal audit plan is approved by the audit committee, and the internal auditor reports out. And there's typically an executive session, meaning a private session where no one in management other than the internal auditor is meeting with the board members. And that's true of the external auditor and frequently the general counsel as well.
And indeed, the only employee that the board has is the internal auditor. And that was to give some independence to this employee, that they are hired and reviewed and dismissed if they have to by the audit committee.
Exactly.
If I'll jump in here, there was a question that does the audit committee get involved in a global safety recall? The audit committee is also the kitchen sink. A lot of things come to it which doesn't fit nicely in comp or nom and gov. But I would say, yes, it depends, but most certainly from a compliance standpoint, to ensure that something was done, to ensure that, again, from an oversight standpoint, to ensure that a process was followed. And that's their point about safety recalls. So again, getting a little geeky on the law thing, the most recent a very recent decision out of Delaware, which was shocking to some folks and caused a little of shocks in corporate governance, was the Delaware Supreme Court coming down on an ice cream company on its board, in which the company had some listeria outbreaks and people actually passed away. And then they had to take remedial actions, and they found that it was sort of bad piping and leaking of stuff into the ice cream, which made it to market and people passed away. It happened again. There were shareholder lawsuits, and it ultimately made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Delaware Supreme Court said, you had one product called ice cream. You had one job to ask that question. Did you fix it? And there was no evidence that the board ever asked those questions about, did you fix it? Did you fix it well? Basic questions that there was no evidence that was asked. So I'm equating that to a recall, that you have responsibilities from a compliance standpoint to ask these questions, and perhaps the audit committee may pick it up in its usual routine of what it does. And remember, internal audit reports to the audit committee. So they have a man, or they have a woman, they have a person on the ground inside the company who can do that work.
So any more questions? Yeah.
Does the audit committee oversee cybersecurity is the question.
And the answer is kitchen sink. So yes, unless someone else oversees it is really the question. It's something boards know that they have to have some involvement in it. It is frequently given to the audit committee because of this risk oversight function, but not always, and there's no requirement that it be with the audit committee. And just to give you one example, I once spoke to a board member who said, well, we have cyber oversight at our nominating and governance committee. And he said the reason was because the one person on the board who really knew about cyber happened to be on the nominating and governance committee and not on the audit committee. Now, why? That was a whole other discussion. But sometimes it's just a matter of, it follows the expertise, it follows who has more time, but the default does tend to be the audit committee, absolutely. On the compensation, any other questions about audit before I move on?
Yes, I have a question, Susan.
Yes.
Cases like, for example, Citigroup that is facing a consent order, is that, and this is something extremely relevant. So is the audit committee the one responsible to do the oversight that the responses to the regulator are the proper ones? So what is the role of the board when they face a situation like that? That we just, it's quite visible.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about cities situations specifically, but just in general, when there's been a big issue and there is regulatory oversight. So first of all, in a financial services company, there would be a risk committee.
Okay.
And so it might, be at the risk committee, but ultimately, and this is a really important point, no matter what committee is actually doing the work, the full board is responsible for strategy, for risk, for compliance. And that there's sometimes, kind of this kind of question about, well, but if you move it into a committee, is that going to take away the responsibility of the board? And the answer is no. The committee is doing the work, but the full board is ultimately responsible.
Thank you.
Stephen, anything you want to add on that?
Nope, I think you got it.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so we'll move on to the compensation committee. And I'm going to caveat this by saying that what you're looking at on that slide is, sort of compensation committee 1, maybe 2.0, but we're at 3.0 now. So this is kind of the core of what the compensation committee does. And then I'll tell you what they do in more progressive companies, which is all of this plus a whole lot of other responsibilities. So basically, CEO approve the goals, approve the, evaluate the performance, approve the compensation. And here again, where, there's a little bit of back and forth between the board and the committee. So the compensation committee technically will typically review the CEO's performance, make a decision as to what the CEO's bonus, et cetera, should be. But typically it is all of the independent directors of the board who approve that compensation. And in this context, when I say independent directors, I mean non-management directors. So obviously not the CEO. If there's a CFO or some other senior executive on the board, that person would not be involved too. So the rest of the directors would get together, but they're going to be relying very, very heavily on the work done by the compensation committee, and the compensation committee will work very, very closely with a compensation consultant. The compensation for senior executives is still pretty hands-on, but not quite at the same level necessarily as that of the CEO. Depending on the board. Some boards say we want to approve it all. Other boards say, look, you're the CEO, these people report to you. We want to see it. We want to feel comfortable with it. If we don't like it, we're going to tell you in such a way that you are going to go and make changes, but you, CEO, are approving the compensation for your CFO and your head of HR and blah, blah, blah. So that's typically the way that it would work, but sometimes the actual committee says we want to be the ones to make that approval. But in either way, the committee will take a very careful look at it. And again, a compensation consultant is going to be involved in that as well. Compensation philosophy and disclosures are more broad. This goes beyond the executive team. This goes the company as a whole. Now, traditionally, that's been fairly narrow. It's, do we issue stock options? Do we have a policy that says you can't backdate stock options, hopefully? Do we, what's our mix of options and, restricted stock? Where do we want to be in terms of the percentile? Do we want to be, the top compensator to be competitive, or do we want to be somewhere in the middle, or what quartile do we want to be on? When I say compensation philosophy, those are the kinds of decisions. So they're not saying, we think that person X in this plant is making too much or too little, but it's that, sort of very, very macro. Now, some of the additional responsibilities that they have taken on as the world has become more interested in the board's involvement on human capital matters, first of all, starts with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, namely pay equity.
Hello.
Hi, Liz.
Hey, so I just sent over
Elizabeth, you're live in center. There we go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yep.
By the way, this is if you don't mind, Susan, I'll use this opportunity to cut in here
Sure,
and just say, from a compensation discussion and analysis for publicly traded companies that are reporting through the SEC, they actually have to present a compensation discussion and analysis. It's a pretty long philosophy and discussion that's in your proxy about how the firm thinks about compensation of its NEOs, of its named executive officers, which is 5 people, one of whom is going to be the CEO. And it's a pretty long, sometimes it's 45 pages, but it's in the proxy. They sign off on it. Their names are on it. It's the comp committee that does that, and they have to do that every year.
And Stephen, before you turn it back to me, do you want to talk about say on pay briefly too?
Yep. Dodd-Frank gave us say on pay, which is the colloquial term for a non-binding vote that shareholders get to have every year or every 3 years, but it's typically every year. You get to choose if you're going to do it every 3 years or every year. Most companies do it every year because that's what shareholders wanted. And they get to vote on how shareholders feel about the CEO's pay. And we've almost had 10 years of it through Dodd-Frank. I think we've had 7 or 8 really after it was it became promulgated and enforced. And 96 to 98% of companies pass their say on pay. This year, however, is pretty interesting. We saw that number dip. And again, the whole overwhelming majority of companies pass it. I think this year we'll see the total be maybe 95% or 94%. And so the overwhelming majority of companies pass this. The overwhelming majority of companies pass it by a wide margin. But there are those who fail it, and there are those who come close. And this is something in which it's like college football. You want to beat someone really bad. You just don't want to win by 1 point. You don't want to get 51%. You want to get 95%. And if you get 75%, that's passing, and you'll pass the class. But you'll be on the radar screen. You really don't want to get below 80%.
Thanks. So, some of the other topics that compensation committees have taken on these days, this starts to say, diversity, equity, and inclusion, pay equity, where they'll look at how our first, there's 2 components of it. One is if people are doing the same work, are they paid appropriately for the work they're doing? Then looking at the organization as a whole. So if all the straight, white, middle-aged men are the ones that are making money and everyone else is sort of at the bottom of the ladder, they may be getting paid appropriately for the work they're doing. But why aren't they doing different types of work and getting better compensation? So that's the pay equity pieces. And And diversity, equity, and inclusion, those numbers of, how many women and men, how many Latinos, how many Black employees, how many Asian employees, there's a lot of pressure on companies to disclose that information, which, as you can imagine, is a very difficult discussion because most companies don't have great numbers, let's face it. So that's a discussion that's going on company by company. There's no, kind of bright line answer to it at the moment, but there are more and more companies that are starting to disclose that information because there's a lot of pressure to disclose it, and investors are asking quite a lot. The next thing is the human capital strategy. Just, this whole question of, what are, and culture comes into that too. What are our values as a company, and how do we treat people? Are we providing environment where they have, flexible workspaces? What about workforce wellness? What's the mix of humans and machines, and how are they, we managing that? So all of those workforce capital and strategy issues, which frankly used to be management issues and still are now discussed in the boardroom in ways that they have not been before. And that's putting a lot more on the workload of the Nominating and Governance Committee. And getting back to the earlier question about CHROs, it used to be CHROs were, to be blunt, considered technicians. And I say that because lawyers were put in the same category. So, we were all in it together. But for, with the boards having to deal with all of these issues, there is a recognition, wow, there are some very deep and meaty human capital strategic issues that companies are managing, and a good CHRO can really help us as a board think that through. And so more and more CHROs are finding their way into the boardroom in ways that had not been the case before. Questions about compensation committee before we move on to nominating and governance? No. Okay. So nominating and governance used to be the committee that only met once or twice a year. Everyone was jealous of it because all you did was, if someone was retiring, you went out and you found a replacement, and usually it was, sort of the protege who played golf with the person who was retiring, or, kind of someone within the immediate network. And you did a board evaluation every year. That's all changed. So with, first of all, with Sarbanes-Oxley, which was 2002, I believe, effective in 2003, required something called governance guidelines. And those are in the bailiwick of the Nominating and Governance Committee. And what that, and by the way, as Stephen said, with respect to the charters, the same is true for governance guidelines. These are all public. So you can find them for any public company. The governance guidelines will go through things like what are the requirements for a board member? What are we looking for? If the company has a board diversity statement, which more and more are starting to have, it will be in the governance guidelines. It talks about the committees. It talks about the fact that board members will attend the annual meeting. Basically sort of the the nuts and bolts of the structure and operation of the board. Some boards go beyond that, and they're much more specific about board education, about board engagement, but not all. So, you know, the board will be kind of going through this question of, okay, what do we want to put in writing as a stake in the ground that says we will be doing this, and you know, this will make us an effective board. So that's the governance guideline. The committee structure. So going back to the question about where cyber sits, the answer to that question is often, it depends on what the nominating and governance committee recommends. And so the nominating and governance committee is the one that will step back and say, okay, this is the workload of the board. We've got all these things to do. We know the 3 committees have to do what's on these lists, but we've got all this other stuff, which is in that right-hand column, and we'll go through a little bit more of that. But you know, where is that going to go, and how is that going to get done? And that is what the nominating, that is within the province of the nominating and governance committee. And then the last thing is performance evaluations. So under the stock listing standards, every committee is required to do its own performance evaluation. The bare minimum is an evaluation. And sometimes what that means is they just kind of all look at each other and say, did we do a good job this year? Yep, let's go have a drink. Sometimes it's a lot more robust than that. And some of the larger companies will even frequently bring in outside people to do, you know, kind of really deep dives into evaluations. But every committee must do a performance evaluation. The nominating and governance committee not only does its own committee performance evaluation, but it's in charge of the process of the performance evaluation for the full board itself. And often more and more companies do evaluations of individual directors as well. And so that would be within the nominating and governance committee's province to organize that. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions about nominating and governance, and then we'll go on to some of the issues on that right column. I know many of them we've already covered, but let me stop before I do. No. Okay.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And anything on your end, Stephen, that you?
Nope.
Okay.
No, I'm just keeping time. We got 20 minutes.
Okay, we're good. We're good. So when you think about joining a board, you're not only joining a board, you're joining the committees. So it's critical to know what your skill sets are and how that's going to feed into the committees. So things like, you know, we talked about cybersecurity, data privacy and ethics. Some boards are saying we need to get our arms around this. It's like risk, as we talked about, it is a full board responsibility, but some do have committees where they will look into that. Again, not required. You know, some boards, you know, for example, Facebook being the example, has a committee of external advisors. But where the issue is, how do we get our arms around this process and what the company's governance is with respect to data privacy and ethics issues? There may well be a board committee, or it may sit within one of the other committees. Same with technology strategy. Now, should technology strategy be any different than boards, you know, company strategy in a sophisticated company? Absolutely not. When you have your strategic offsite, the technology is going to be interwoven into every aspect of the strategic discussion. And when you examine aspects of strategy during the course of the year, it's going to be woven into every aspect. However, in a lot of companies, they're kind of at the point, as you all know better even than I do, where they're saying, gee, we have to get our arms around this e-commerce thing. We have to figure out our digital strategy. We have to make digital growth a priority. How are we going to do that? And again, it's a management role to figure that out. Obviously, that's not the board's role, but it would not be uncommon for a company where something like this is absolutely critical to their ability to function on a long-term basis, to say, you know what, we're going to put together a committee. It may be a standing committee, which is an ongoing committee, or it may be an ad hoc committee, so it's done for a specific purpose. You know, we're going to have a committee for a year, and then hopefully it'll be, you know, sort of more at a point where we can integrate it into the work of the board itself, or maybe not. So again, there's no right answer, but technology strategy may be in a committee. Investor ESG, we talked about investor engagement as an aspect of that is frequently within the nominating and governance committee. And sometimes that leads the nominating and governance committee to have responsibility for ESG in total as a topic. Again, every board is different. There's no requirement, but that would be something that would commonly be seen in boards. And by the way, if you read the charter, you can always tell, or if you read the proxy where the committee describes its work, you can always tell whether it has any of these other things in it. Human capital strategy, DEI, culture, we talked about. Climate change is another one where, you know, oil and gas companies are going to have a committee focused on climate because it's so integral to their business model. I know of an airline that has a climate working group at the board level. Most companies are not going to have a specific committee devoted to climate, although again, they might if they've decided to put together a very aggressive set of climate goals, and they want to have that, you know, sort of focused expertise and the deep dive that a committee can afford that you can't really do at the board level. You know, same thing with other aspects of the environment, whether it's recycling, water usage, what have you. I've heard of boards have strategy committees and have finance committees. I will tell you my opinion of those is that there needs to be a specific reason for that, because there's sometimes can be a danger that a committee can be sort of a quasi shadow board, where if you have a strategy committee, so, you know, all the work gets done at the committee level, the board really should be taking that on as a whole. It may be, again, a special situation, but as you're going and looking at boards, if you see a strategy committee, I would just question, why is there a strategy committee? Some of these other issues, reputation, political stance, crisis oversight, again, perfect for a committee because they're deep dive issues, they require an expertise, and it's hard to take up time at the board meeting to cover those. So where do they sit? No one knows. It really depends. If it's viewed as more of a risk issue, maybe audit. If it's viewed as more of a stakeholder issue, maybe nominating and governance issue. If it's viewed as more of an employment issue, maybe compensation, or, you know, any of the above. But again, these are some of the things that, depending on the board, you may find covered at the committee level. So moving to the next slide. not every board, but a lot of boards will disclose a matrix, either, in this nice graphic matrix form, or just in, sort of a narrative, this person sits on this committee, et cetera. This was one that I happened to find, and I thought it was a perfect example. It's obviously a company that only has the 3 standing required committees. But if you look at this, you've got a chair and 3 members in every single committee. So there's a perfect balance there. When you're thinking about how you would fit into the board, director number 8 is going to be an upset. So where do you go? Probably to the committee that's got the heaviest workload, which may be audit, it may be compensation, potentially nom-gov, although more likely to be audit compensation. But to really think through where, not only where do my skills fit, but where is the need? And what happens to that balance on the board when I come in and, get onto another committee. So it's really important, if you're going to be approaching a board for an interview, to really deeply understand the committee structure and understand who's on, what their skills are, and where there might be gaps, to have a sense of how they might be thinking about you fitting, or where you can kind of position yourself to fit. And that leads then to the last slide. And I know we have just over 10 minutes, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide and then open it up.
Well, there's a question on, is there a limit for the number of board members? What's ideal? No, the board actually sets its number, and it usually says we will have between X and X. And so they set that into the charter, and then periodically they will set the number through a resolution. Now, we have 9 members. By the way, this is very important, that they actually set the number. And if they change the number, they need to change, have it by vote, take a bylaw and make the change. So they usually set the number between 5 and 7, 7 and 12, whatever it might be, then set a number. We'll have 9. And it's typically, as you can imagine, an odd number. Typically an odd number, so that there are no ties. Although these are consensus-driven institutions, rarely do you have ties, and rarely do you have things that are not unanimous. Although you have someone who says, I don't agree with it, and I like it recorded in the minutes. These are consensus-driven institutions. And it depends on the size, depends on the types of company, and also what is historic in your industry. So community banks tend to have very large boards because they have everyone and their mother from different representatives in the community. If you look at your university board, they have 1,000 people. They don't have 1,000, but they may have 30 people on the board. Or the nonprofit you sit on, or if you're independent school, they'll have a lot of folks. Some folks who have paid to play. They've donated money, what have you. Typically, you do want to look at the size of your board. The smaller, the better, but enough that you can get the skill sets in, but not too large where it is unwieldy. And so that's my answer. I don't know if you have another answer, Susan. And there's, do board members typically serve on one or more than one committee, or does it just depend? Well, you know the answer. It does depend. But this is a good point to talk about why it depends. It depends on their skill sets and where the Nom and Gov committee wants to put someone. Sometimes if you're new to the board, they say you're going to do the audit committee, because it's the audit committee where you get to see the financials and you learn about the company, and you're only going to do audit. But you may serve on another committee, and often people do serve on others. But here's the trick. Remember, you have to have the ability to have those meetings. And often when you have a board meeting, it's the first half day is committees that all the committees meet, and they meet at the same time. So if you're on audit committee, it may be hard to also be on the comp committee because they meet at the same, well, it will be hard. If they meet at the same time, you can't be on both, right? So there's a scheduling thing. And I go through this when boards are trying to create another committee, an ESG committee, a strategy committee, whatever it might be. So remember, you got to staff it, right? And so when you look at your calendar, things can't meet at the same time because you already have two committees meeting at the same time. You can't add a third, right? So you got to think about that. So it does depend on serving on multiple committees because you can't serve on everything because of just timing. You know, they'll meet at the same time.
So, and I would just add one thing to that too, which, and I agree with that completely. For boards where the committees don't meet at the same time, I've seen the nominating and governance committee be very careful about making sure there is overlap. And the reason is to avoid silos. You know, you don't want the risk committee talking about something and the audit committee is talking about a different aspect of the same topic, and they, you know, never the twain shall meet, and they come up with totally different. So
Right.
if you meet, you will see, you know, members sitting on more than one for that sole purpose of providing, you know, kind
I said, I'm sorry, let me just go back to the other question. I said I'd give you a story on that. There was a very large corporation, very, very large. Some of you know it as Target, who about 10 or so years ago, when the Dayton Hudson family sold out and left the board, they didn't adjust, management didn't adjust the size of the board. And what happened was an activist investor came in and said, you have 2 board seats open. And they said, no, we don't, we have 1. They said, no, and there was a fight about that. And then there was a proxy fight about strategy. And it was never really resolved before the end of that proxy fight. And so the activists put 3 people up, including actually it was 2 seats that were up. And then this third one, which the management team said didn't exist. But they said it did. The activist said it did because you didn't close the loop there. And to tell you the truth, they made a mistake. The company made a mistake. But luckily for them, the activist lost the battle, so he did not get seated along with his 2 other members who he had put up. So the company was okay. But they made a mistake and did not go back and change their bylaw, setting the actual number of board down from 12 to 11. And they left the seat open, in which there was a fight for it.
So this last slide, I think it's pretty clear what it is, but just, you know, to walk you through it. So, you know, again, just driving home this point over and over and over again, that it's about what you bring to the boardroom as a board member, but it's also about what slots you fill in, you know, committee. So I just want to just a couple of things. Financial expertise. An audit committee must, under SEC rules, have someone who qualifies as a financial expert, which doesn't mean that everyone on the audit committee has to qualify. And there's some very specific rules about how you qualify. If you have prior audit firm experience, internal audit experience, CFO, you know, there's various ways. But the reason I bring it up is because if you do qualify as a financial expert, be sure to mention it. And because people will keep that in mind. It's like, oh, great, this is someone I can put on the audit committee. Yvonne, you know, question, will we cover creating a board bio? The answer is yes and no. We'll talk about how you can think about it. And I think, these are some of the things that go into it. If you're a financial expert, make sure to mention it. If you're being considered for a specific board opening, know their committees. And if they have a cyber committee, for example, or a technology strategy committee, that's what you lead with. Whereas if they don't, you may not want to, you may want to lead with, more of your business experience and say, oh, by the way, I can do this. So just think about your positioning in that context. And that's really all this slide is about. All of these things, I call it board composition bingo. It really is, because the way that boards do searches is they say, well, we want someone who has experience in our industry, who knows about commercialization, who is expert in risk, is a financial expert, has ESG expertise, HR expertise, marketing expertise. Oh yeah, we get it. We're not going to find all of that in one person. So how do we, kind of find the closest? And that's pretty much the way these things work. So you may think that you're being interviewed for a board seat because of your cyber experience, but in fact, you find out it's actually totally something different that they decide they're interested in. And then, the personal attributes, the gravitas is in the middle, because it's this whole concept of fit. Do people envision you as someone sitting around the board table and challenging management, including the CEO, on strategic issues? Then they're also going to look at, your independence, prior company performance, and connections. And I'm going to go to the last question. I know we're at the end of our time, which is, boards met much more during COVID. Absolutely. How often will the board meet in normal times? Again, as is the answer to everything, it depends, but a typical cadence would be every other month, and once a year, that would be an extended board meeting where there would be a strategy offsite. And then the committees would generally meet the same, either the day after or before the board meeting, or around the same time as the board meeting. And then there may be extra committee meetings, which would not necessarily be in person, such as the audit committee meetings that I mentioned prior to the quarterly earnings reports. And be aware that if you talk to a recruiter and they have a specific board that they're interested in, one of the first questions that they will actually ask you is, are you available on X, Y, and Z dates? Because boards do plan their calendars out for, 2-3 years. And if someone misses a board meeting, it has to be reported in the proxy. So they want to make sure going in that, obviously emergencies would have you come up, but they want to make sure going in that you're going to be able to make the board meetings that they already have set. So on that note, I think we are at the end of time, and it has been a delight, a pleasure. Please, if there are any other questions that we haven't gotten to, send us an email. If you don't know how to reach us, Viviana can help you. If we don't hear from you, enjoy the rest of the summer.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Stephen. Real quick note, first, appreciate you all joining us today. This session has been recorded and we'll update it in the board readiness resource page that you've been emailed. And if you don't have it, let me know. I'm happy to resend it again. Our next session is September 23rd, So we look forward to seeing you then. But as Susan mentioned, any questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank
All right,
you,
everybody.
Alexia.
Thank you.
Take care. All right.
Thanks,
bye.
everybody.